July 14, 1944. So 9:12 a.m. Sector north of St. Hel, Normandy. The air smelled not of morning freshness, but of a mixture of diesel exhaust, rotting foliage, and the sweet, sickly scent of burning flesh that tankers called the aroma of defeat. The ground beneath the feet of the 2nd Armored Division vibrated, a low rumble hitting the gut, the frequency of pure animal fear. Sergeant Curtis J. Culin, 29 years old, a former taxi driver from Cranford, New Jersey, stood knee-deep in mud and watched another machine die. 50 meters ahead, a 32-ton M4 Sherman tank was trying to do what it was built for: advance. The Ford GAA V8 engine roared at the limit of its 500 horsepower, spewing clouds of blue smoke. The track spun furiously, biting into an earthen embankment 8 feet high. But this wasn't just an embankment. This was Bocage, a Norman hedgerow. For hundreds of years, French farmers had piled stones and earth here, and the roots of ancient oaks and shrubs had woven it all into a structure stronger than reinforced concrete. The tank crawled upward, its nose pitched up at a 40-degree angle. In that moment, the Sherman ceased to be a fighting machine. It became a helpless turtle flipped on its back, its main gun pointed at the sky, useless against the enemy on the ground. And worst of all, it exposed its belly. The tank's underside, protected by only a half-inch sheet of steel, the thinnest point in the entire structure. On the other side of the hedge, just 12 meters away, a German corporal waited. He didn't rush. He had the perfect target. He calmly raised his disposable Panzerfaust 60 grenade launcher. Click, hiss, impact. The shape-charged jet burned through the tank's belly in 0.15 seconds. The explosion inside the fighting compartment was monstrous. The 8-ton turret jumped and crashed back down, skewed. Flames didn't erupt from the hatches. They were sucked inside by the vacuum of the detonation. 5 American boys, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, died instantly, turned to charcoal inside their own machine. Curtis Culin spat viscous saliva into the dirt. That was the 19th tank in 3 days. The statistics he saw with his own eyes were worse than any nightmare. The U.S. Army, which had landed in France a month ago in triumph, was now stuck. Progress was measured in yards. For every yard, they paid with a gallon of blood. Allied casualties in the Hedgerow War reached 2,500 men a day. The world's greatest industrial machine had been stopped by medieval fences. "We aren't fighting Germans, Mac," Culin rasped to his mechanic, Corporal Stephen. "We're fighting damn botany, and the botany is winning." That evening, the mood in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron camp was funereal. Soldiers sat in dugout foxholes, trying not to raise their heads. German snipers had learned to shoot at the sound of a ration tin opening. Culin sat by a cold fire, flipping a Zippo lighter in his hands. His hands, accustomed to turning the wheel of a New York taxi and fixing carburetors, trembled from overexertion. He wasn't a strategist. He didn't understand General Bradley's maps, but he understood mechanics. The problem was physical. The tank was trying to climb over the obstacle, losing protection and traction. It didn't need to climb up. It needed to go through. The conversation started by accident, like all great discoveries. "You know what we need?" said a young private from Tennessee, picking at the ground with a bayonet. "We need teeth, huge steel teeth on the front, to bite into this crap." Culin froze. The click of the Zippo sounded like a gunshot. He remembered Omaha Beach, the place where thousands of boys had landed a month ago. The sand there was still soaked in oil and blood, but more importantly, it was littered with metal. Rommel's German engineers had built thousands of anti-landing obstacles there. Czech Hedgehogs, massive structures of 3 crossed steel beams designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft. Krupp steel, heavy, hardened, created to kill Americans. What if he took their weapon, cut off a piece, and welded it to the nose of an American tank? Return their steel to them, right in the face? "Gather the boys," Culin said, standing up, "and find me a welding torch. We're going to the beach." July 16, 1944. Omaha Beach. The trip for materials was a suicide mission. The rear areas were still crawling with saboteurs, and the roads were under artillery fire. But the real danger waited for them on the sand. The beach was a graveyard of ships and machinery. And it was still mined. German Tellermine 43s, hidden in the sand, could blow the wheels off a truck along with the axle. Culin and his team of 4 mechanics worked like damned souls. The wind from the English Channel threw salty spray mixed with sand into their faces. They dragged acetylene tanks to the nearest Hedgehog. The torch flared with a blinding white flame, heating the metal to 1,500 degrees. Cutting German steel was hard. It was viscous, high quality. Sparks flew like rain, burning through their coveralls. "Sergeant! Air!" the lookout screamed. A pair of German Messerschmitts, having broken through the air defense screen, passed on a strafing run, spraying the beach with machine gun fire. Geysers of sand erupted a meter from the oxygen tanks. If a bullet had hit a tank, nothing would have remained of Culin's team but dog tags. They dropped into the wet sand, pressing themselves into craters. As soon as the roar of the planes faded, Culin was the first to jump to his feet. "Don't sleep! Cut! We need to load the truck before the tide comes in." By evening, they returned to base with 2 tons of rusty, twisted metal. The next 24 hours turned into an engineering marathon. Culin didn't sleep. He designed on the fly, right on the tank's armor. No blueprints, no stress calculations. Only a mechanic's intuition. They took a light M5A1 Stuart tank. Culin personally welded the first seam. 4 prongs, each about a meter long. He welded them to the front of the final drive housing and reinforced them with gussets. The design looked ugly. Crude, rusty horns sticking forward and slightly down. "Looks like shit, Sarge," the corporal said honestly. "It's a rhino," Culin replied, lifting his mask. His face was red from the welding UV burns, his eyes watering. "And it's supposed to be mean." July 18th, the proving ground. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, stood with his arms crossed. Beside him, a retinue of colonels looked at the Stuart with the welded trash with undisguised skepticism. "Sergeant Culin claims this will solve the problem that is costing us a division?" asked an engineering colonel. "This is amateur hour." Culin heard them but didn't look. He walked up to the tank driver. "Listen to me. Don't stop. If you break before impact, we're disgraced. Pedal to the metal. Hit that wall like it owes you money." The tank roared. The hedgerow in front of it was chosen specifically, the oldest, the thickest, nearly 3 meters high. Acceleration, 15 miles per hour. 10 meters, 5. The colonels instinctively took a step back. The impact was so powerful that the ground beneath the general's feet jumped. But the tank didn't pitch up. The teeth of the rhino plunged into the base of the embankment, biting under the roots. The inertia of the 15-ton machine focused on 4 points of weld. There was a sound like a machine gun burst. Crack, crack, crack. It was the roots of 100-year-old oaks snapping. The tank passed through the embankment, pushing a wave of earth and bush ahead of it like an icebreaker in ice. It didn't climb over it. It destroyed it. 4 seconds later, it popped out the other side, maintaining a horizontal position, gun ready for battle. Silence on the proving ground lasted a moment. "Jesus Christ," whispered Bradley. He turned to Culin. "Sergeant, how many of these can you make before Operation Cobra starts?" "Depends on how many welders we have, sir." "You have every welder in France. You have all the metal on the coast. Start immediately." July 20th, 24. The assembly line of hell. It was the strangest factory of World War II. In the fields of Normandy, under camouflage nets, hundreds of men worked. The flashes of arc welding didn't fade for a second, creating a surreal light show. Curtis Culin became the foreman of this madness. He slept 2 hours a day, sitting in the back of a Jeep. Problems multiplied. Electrodes ran out. Generators overheated. Welders went blind from arc eye, but continued to work by touch. Command set an impossible task: equip 300 tanks in 4 days. By noon on July 24th, they had done 350. More than 60% of the 2nd Armored Division's tanks now had horns. But the scariest part was ahead. Operation Cobra was scheduled for the morning of July 25th. The Germans knew something was brewing. Their intelligence reported engine noise. They moved the elite Panzer-Lehr Division to the front line. Hundreds of PAK-43 anti-tank guns and heavy Panther tanks took up positions behind the hedgerows, creating a deeply echeloned defense that was impossible to penetrate head-on. They expected the Americans to climb over the top again. They had prepared the perfect trap. July 25th, 1944. 09:38 a.m. Saint-El, Pirier Road. The start of Operation Cobra felt like the end of the world. The American command decided to punch a hole not just with tanks. First came the bombers, 1,500 heavy B-17s and B-24s, followed by hundreds of medium bombers. The earth shook violently. Curtis Culin, sitting in the commander's hatch of a modified Sherman, felt his teeth chattering from the vibration. But the bombing, powerful as it was, didn't destroy the hedgerows. When the smoke cleared, the green walls stood, scarred but intact. And behind them were still Germans, deafened, concussed, but alive and with fingers on triggers. "All crews," the colonel's voice crackled in the headphones. "Code Rhino, advance!" The tank engine roared. Culin patted the gunner on the shoulder. "Hold on, son. Now we test my welding for strength." The tank lurched forward. Ahead was a wall of green hiding death. Usually, a tanker feels terror before an obstacle. But now Culin felt a vicious joy. Impact, grinding metal, darkness. Tons of earth, branches and stones crashed onto the armor, but the Rhino held the blow. The tank passed through the hedgerow in 3 seconds. They burst into a small field. Right in front of them, 50 meters away, stood a camouflaged MG-42 machine gun position and a crew with a Panzerschreck. The Germans looked at them with an expression of absolute, paralyzing incomprehension. They expected the tank to show its belly. They expected it to get stuck. Instead, a steel monster with rusty horns appeared out of nowhere, straight through the wall, without slowing down, with its gun barrel level. "Fire! Canister!" screamed Culin. The Sherman's 75mm gun barked. The canister shell, filled with hundreds of steel balls, turned the German position into a bloody mess. "Forward! Don't stop!" commanded Culin. To the right and left, dozens of other tanks were doing the same. The entire German defensive line, calculated for static battles near roads, instantly became useless. The Americans no longer used roads. They walked through the landscape. By noon, the breakthrough turned into a rout, but the Germans wouldn't be Germans if they gave up without a fight. At 1:15 p.m., Culin's tank, smashing through another hedge, found itself nose to nose with a panther. It was an unequal fight. The German tank weighed 45 tons, its frontal armor was impenetrable to the Sherman's gun, and its long-barreled 75mm cannon could drill through the American tank from a kilometer away. But the distance was only 40 meters. "Driver, hard left, into the bushes!" Culin shouted. The driver yanked the lever. The Sherman swerved sharply and slammed into the adjacent perpendicular hedge at full speed. The Panther's turret began to turn, but too slowly. Culin used his invention not for attack, but for maneuver. His tank punched a passage through the side wall and disappeared into a cloud of dust before the German could fire. "Flank him! Get behind him!" Culin yelled. 10 seconds later, they popped out of the neighboring hedge, appearing behind the Panther. "Armor piercing! Engine block! Fire!" The shell hit the rear of the German tank. A fuel explosion threw a pillar of fire 10 meters into the air. The crew began bailing out of the burning machine. By the evening of July 25th, the front was broken wide open across 6 miles. General Bayerlin, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, reported to headquarters with the desperation of a doomed man. "American tanks are appearing everywhere. They ignore obstacles. My anti-tank guns are bypassed and crushed. We cannot stop them because they don't drive where they are supposed to." Tactics changed. Tanks with Culin's horns began using a terrifying technique called burial. Instead of smoking infantry out of trenches, they drove along the hedgerow, slicing the edge of the berm with the rhino. The earth collapsed downward, burying German soldiers alive in their own foxholes. It was brutal, it was terrifying, but it was effective. In the 48 hours of Operation Cobra, the 2nd Armored Division advanced deeper than in the previous 6 weeks. They took thousands of prisoners. They destroyed hundreds of guns. And all this thanks to pieces of scrap metal and a taxi driver's wits. According to the most conservative staff estimates, Culin's invention preserved the combat effectiveness of over 300 tanks and saved the lives of 4,200 American soldiers in the first days of the operation alone. If not for the rhinos, these men would have burned in the narrow corridors of the Bocage. November 1944, Chartigen Forest, Germany. The war didn't end in Normandy. It only got meaner. Sergeant Curtis Culin, now a division legend, a hero whose hand generals shook, refused to transfer to the rear. He said his place was in a tank until the last Nazi surrendered. The Chartigen Forest was a different kind of hell. There were no hedgerows here. There were mines and dark, gloomy spruce trees. Culin was walking ahead of the column, conducting reconnaissance on foot. Cautious, experienced, survivor of hundreds of battles. He didn't notice the thin whisker of wire in the fallen pine needles. Or maybe it was a pressure plate S-mine, the Bouncing Betty. Click. The mine jumped to waist height and detonated. The blast wave threw Culin against a tree. His left leg was shattered and severed below the knee. Shrapnel riddled his thigh and chest. When medics ran to him under mortar fire, they thought he was dead. But Culin was conscious. He didn't scream. He looked at his severed leg with the same grim calm with which he had looked at burning tanks in Normandy. In his convulsively clenched hand, they found not a pistol, but a piece of melted metal, a talisman, a fragment of the first weld of the rhino. The war for the taxi driver from New Jersey was over. He survived. Doctors saved him, but he returned home on crutches. In 1945, back in the U.S., he received a package. It didn't contain medals. It contained a photograph. 50 dirty, unshaven, smiling tankers stood in front of the Eiffel Tower in liberated Paris. They held a sign hastily scrawled on cardboard. "Thanks for Paris, Curtis. We are here because of your iron." Curtis Culin died in 1963 at the age of just 48. A heart that withstood the hell of Normandy couldn't withstand peaceful life. History often remembers commanders, Patton, Eisenhower, Montgomery. But victory in Europe was not forged only in headquarters. It was cut with acetylene and welded with electric arcs by ordinary guys who looked at an unsolvable problem and said, "I can fix this." Sergeant Culin proved that one man, one idea, and a pile of rusty trash can be worth more than an entire armored division.